The dog noticed her first. That was the thing nobody talked about later, when the reports were filed and the administrators were called in and everyone started choosing their words carefully. Nobody mentioned that the dog, a big scarred Belgian Malinois named Ranger, had lifted his head and watched Nurse Daly cross the hallway before his handler even knew she was there, and that Corporal Hess, who had not made eye contact with a single member of staff in 4 days, had watched the dog watch her and then watched her too. Nora Daly had been a nurse for 6 years. She had worked night shifts at Kessler Regional Medical Center for 3 of them. She knew what the behavioral health unit smelled like at 2 in the morning: industrial cleaner and bad coffee, and something underneath both that she had never found a word for. She knew which lights flickered in the east corridor. She knew which call buttons stuck. She knew, without having to be told, when something in a room was wrong. Room 14 had been wrong since Tuesday. The patient's name was Corporal James Hess, 31 years old, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, admitted with a shrapnel wound to the left leg that had gotten infected badly enough to require surgical debridement. The wound itself was healing. The rest of him was not. His intake file said he had a service dog approved under federal ADA accommodation. His intake file said the dog's name was Ranger and that he had been trained specifically for Hess's PTSD episodes, hypervigilance, nightmares. His intake file said this clearly on the first page, in the section that nobody apparently read. Nora had read it. She had read it Thursday morning, when she came in early and pulled the chart herself, because something about the way the day shift nurses talked about room 14 during handoff. The careful language, the lowered voices, the phrase "he won't cooperate" used 3 times in 4 minutes had made her want to know more before she walked in there. She walked in at 6:14 p.m., start of her shift, Ranger's leash in one hand and a cup of terrible coffee in the other. Hess was sitting up against the headboard with his arms crossed and his eyes on the door. He was wearing the same clothes he'd apparently been wearing for 2 days because he refused to change in front of anyone, and the hospital gown situation had gone badly the first night. There were dark circles under his eyes deep enough to look like bruises. The TV was off. The lights were low. Ranger saw her, and the tension went out of his body like air from a tire. Hess watched the dog do that. He didn't say anything. His eyes moved to Nora and stayed there. She set the coffee on the windowsill, not for him, just to have her hands free, and she crouched down to Ranger's level. She let him come to her on his own terms. He pressed his nose against her palm, and she scratched behind his ears, and she said quietly, without looking up at Hess, "Ranger." Just the name. Nothing else. Hess was quiet for a long time. Then, "How do you know his name? It's in your file, front page." He said nothing. "I read your whole file," she said. She stood up and met his eyes directly, which she had learned over years was either the right thing or the wrong thing, and there was no way to know in advance. "Ranger's been with you for what, 2 years?" 2.5. He's trained for grounding, nightmares, hypervigilance. Hess looked at her like she had said something dangerous, like she was holding a grenade and the only question was whether the pin was still in. "Yeah, then I don't understand," Nora said, "why nobody has brought him to you before now." The silence that followed was the kind she had learned to wait out. "They said dogs weren't allowed in this unit," Hess said finally. His voice was flat. "First night. Orderly told me Ranger had to stay at the front desk. I said he couldn't. They said it was policy." He stopped. "I asked for the policy in writing. Nobody brought it." Nora thought about the policy she had looked up that morning. She thought about the ADA. She thought about the Veterans Access to Care Act, which she had also looked up, and which was perfectly clear on the subject of service animals accompanying veteran patients in federal and federally contracted medical facilities. Kessler Regional held 3 active VA contracts. She thought, "Someone is going to have a very bad week." She said, "I'm going to fix this." Tonight, Hess looked at her the way people looked at you when they had heard that exact sentence too many times and watched it mean nothing each time. "I'm not telling you to trust me," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do." That's different. She left Ranger with him, which, technically, she was not supposed to do without authorization, and which she did anyway, because Ranger was a certified service animal and his handler was in visible psychological distress, and the decision seemed uncomplicated to her. She walked to the nurse's station, pulled up the VA contract documentation on the unit computer, printed 3 pages, and went to find her charge nurse. Her charge nurse was Deborah Crane. Deborah Crane had been the charge nurse on behavioral health for 11 years. She was 61 years old and ran the unit with the kind of efficiency that came from having seen every possible version of a crisis and having developed a response for each one. She was not, in Nora's experience, someone who did things wrong on purpose. She was also not someone who liked being told she had done something wrong. "He has a documented service animal accommodation," Nora said. She put the printed pages on Deborah's desk. ADA and VA contract both require access. Deborah looked at the papers. She looked at Nora. "I'm aware of the ADA, then you know the dog should have been with him since admission." The dog created a disturbance at intake. Ranger was reacting to being separated from his handler. That's not a disturbance. That's a trained animal responding to stress. Nora kept her voice level. She was very good at keeping her voice level. Corporal Hess has had 4 days without his service animal. He hasn't slept. He's refused most of his meals. His wound care is getting harder every day because he doesn't want staff in the room. He's a difficult patient. He's a veteran with PTSD whose legally mandated accommodation has been violated for 4 consecutive days. Nora paused. "I'm not saying anyone meant harm. I'm saying we need to correct it. Tonight." Deborah looked at her for a long moment. "You already brought the dog in, didn't you?" "Yes." A muscle in Deborah's jaw moved. "Nora, he's in there right now. Corporal Hess is calmer than he's been since admission. I checked his vitals before I came here. Heart rate is down 14 beats per minute." Another long moment. "I'll call administration in the morning," Deborah said. "I'd like it documented tonight, that the accommodation was identified and that corrective action was initiated. You'd like it documented." "Yes. Because if this comes up later, I want the record to show that when someone flagged it, the unit responded appropriately." Deborah studied her. Nora had worked with her long enough to know what that look meant. "You're either exactly right or exactly wrong, and I can't tell yet." "Fine," Deborah said. "I'll document it. The dog stays tonight. We sort out the formal process tomorrow. Thank you." Nora went back to room 14. Ranger was lying across Hess's feet. Hess had his eyes closed. He wasn't asleep. She could tell by the way he went still when she opened the door, that combat alertness that never fully turned off. But he was resting, which he apparently hadn't done in 4 days, and that counted for something. She did her checks quietly. Vitals, wound inspection, IV line. He let her without comment, which was different from every prior shift's notes. She was almost at the door when he said, "What's your name?" "Daly," she said. "Nora Daly." He nodded once, looking at the ceiling. "Army?" She shook her head. "Navy. My dad. 2 tours Vietnam." She paused. "I grew up knowing what it looked like when someone brought the war home with them." He didn't respond to that. She didn't expect him to. "Ranger goes where you go," she said. "As long as I'm on shift, that's not changing." She pulled the door closed behind her. The next 8 hours were unremarkable in the way that good nursing often was. A series of small decisions made correctly, quietly, without anyone noticing. She checked on Hess every hour. His vitals normalized. He ate something from his dinner tray for the first time since admission. At 2 a.m., she found him actually asleep, Ranger's chin resting on his knee, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing being exactly as it should be. At 6 a.m., when day shift came on, she gave her handoff report and mentioned clearly that Ranger would be staying with Corporal Hess and that the ADA documentation was in the chart. The day shift nurse was a man named Terry Alt. He was 26, 2 years out of school, and he had the specific brand of confidence that comes from not yet having been wrong about anything important. "We've been trying to get the dog out of the unit," he told her. "Dr. Voss wants him removed." Nora stopped. "Doctor Voss is the attending? Behavioral health attending? Yeah. Has Dr. Voss reviewed the ADA documentation?" Terry shrugged. "I don't know. I just know she said the dog is a liability issue." Nora made a note. She went home. She slept 4 hours, which was what she usually managed, and then she sat at her kitchen table with coffee and pulled up the ADA standards on her laptop and read them again, not because she didn't know them, but because she wanted to be precise. She called the VA Patient Advocate office at 9 a.m. She explained the situation. The advocate, a woman named Cheryl, who had the voice of someone who had heard every version of this story and was quietly tired of it, said she would flag it and follow up with the hospital. At 3 p.m., Nora's phone rang. It was Deborah. Administration wants to talk to you, Deborah said. Tomorrow morning. Before your shift, about Corporal Hess. About several things. Nora said she would be there. She went in the next morning 90 minutes early. The meeting was in a conference room on the 4th floor with a view of the parking garage. Present, the hospital's compliance officer, whose name was Barrett, and the head of nursing operations, whose name was Linda Sue, and Dr. Helen Voss, who was the behavioral health attending, and who looked at Nora with the specific expression of someone who has decided in advance how a conversation is going to go. You admitted a dog to the behavioral health unit without authorization, Dr. Voss said, before anyone else had spoken. I ensured that a documented service animal was reunited with his handler, Nora said. The accommodation was in the patient's intake file. The ADA requires it. Our VA contract requires it. The ADA allows facilities to establish reasonable restrictions, Adi, for service animals. Yes, the restrictions have to be documented and have to be applied consistently. Nora opened the folder she had brought. I requested the unit's written policy on service animals. It doesn't exist. The patient requested it on night 1 of admission. It was never provided to him. She slid a page across the table. That's a violation of ADA Section 36302. Dr. Voss looked at the page. You're not a lawyer, Nurse Daly. No, I'm a nurse. I'm also a mandatory reporter under federal VA contractor guidelines, which means that when I identify a potential civil rights violation affecting a veteran patient, I'm required to document and escalate, which I did. She looked at Barrett. The VA Patient Advocate Office was notified yesterday morning. The room went quiet in a particular way. Barrett, the compliance officer, said, You contacted the VA without going through administration. I went through my charge nurse first. The issue wasn't resolved at the unit level. The patient's accommodation was still being violated. Nora kept her voice even. I followed the escalation protocol. Deborah authorized this? Deborah authorized the dog staying overnight and said she would handle formal documentation in the morning. When I came back for my next shift and learned Dr. Voss had ordered the animal removed, I escalated. Linda Sue was writing something. Barrett had opened his own folder and was looking at something inside it with the focused expression of a man doing rapid calculations. Dr. Voss said, Corporal Hess is a psychiatric patient in a specialized unit. Service animals present legitimate concerns in that environment. The risk assessment should have happened before admission, Nora said. His accommodation was documented. If there were legitimate clinical concerns about the service animal, the right process was to have that conversation with the patient at intake, with documentation, and to work with the VA on alternatives if necessary. She paused. Instead, an orderly told him dogs weren't allowed. No documentation. No clinical rationale, no process, 4 days. She let that sit. He didn't sleep for 4 days. He didn't eat. His wound care compliance dropped to 0. Those are clinical outcomes, Dr. Voss. Not policy questions. Dr. Voss was quiet. Barrett closed his folder. We'll need to review the full intake process. You'll find the accommodation form on page 1 of the intake packet, Nora said. It was filled out by the VA case manager before transfer. It's been in the chart since admission. How many people have had access to that chart? By my count, 14 clinical staff over 4 days. Another silence. Linda Sue looked up from her notes. She was a small woman in her 50s with the expression of someone who was already thinking about the next 10 steps. Nurse Daly, have you discussed this matter with anyone outside the hospital? The VA patient advocate, that's it. Have you spoken with the patient's family? No, the patient himself. Clinically, yes, I've discussed his care with him in the context of my nursing duties. I haven't discussed the administrative situation with him. Linda Sue nodded slowly. I'd like to request that you continue to keep this internal while we conduct our review. I'll keep it internal as long as the review is moving, Nora said. If the review stalls, I'll contact the VA again. I want to be transparent about that. Linda Sue looked at her for a moment. All right. The meeting lasted another 20 minutes. When it ended, Nora went downstairs and changed into her scrubs and went to room 14. Hess was sitting up. Ranger was next to him on the bed, which was technically against policy, and Nora decided that was a problem for a different day. Hess's color was better. His eyes were less like someone looking out from behind glass. Dog's still here, he said. Dog's still here, she confirmed. He studied her. What happened? There's a review process underway. She checked his IV. Your accommodation is going to be formally documented and enforced. That's not a maybe. You sure about that? I made it very clear to some people in a conference room this morning that the alternative involved the VA, a federal contractor audit, and an ADA complaint. So yes, I'm reasonably sure. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. Why? She looked at him. Because it was right, and because it wasn't actually hard. Someone just had to do it. He was quiet for a moment. Ranger lifted his head and rested his chin on Hess's forearm. My dad was Marine, he said. 2 tours. Came back and nobody had a word for what was wrong with him. We just called it the way Dad is. He looked at the dog. Different time, Nora said. It was. You grow up okay? With him? She considered the question. Some of it was hard. Some of it made me who I am. She paused. He taught me that you can be loyal to someone and still tell them the truth. I think that's the most important thing he ever taught me. Hess nodded slowly, like he was filing that away somewhere. Over the next week, things changed in the way that institutional things change when someone has created enough of a paper trail to make inaction more dangerous than action. Slowly, with a lot of language about process improvement and enhanced protocols, but they changed. The Behavioral Health Unit got a formal service animal policy, written, posted. All staff trained on it in a mandatory session that took 2 hours on a Tuesday morning, and that several people complained about in the break room, which Nora heard and said nothing about because she understood that the complaining was not really about the training. Corporal Hess's wound care compliance went to 100%. His sleep improved. On the 3rd day after Ranger was formally reinstated, he allowed the physical therapist into his room, which the PT noted in his chart with what appeared to be genuine surprise. An external compliance review found that the accommodation failure was not isolated. 2 other veteran patients admitted in the previous 6 months had documentation of service animal or specific PTSD-related accommodations that had not been implemented. Both had been discharged with incomplete care plans. The compliance office described the findings as a systemic gap in intake protocol review. The VA Patient Advocate's Office described it differently, in language that was more direct, in a letter that went to the hospital's board of directors. Dr. Voss was not terminated. She was, as the official communication put it, reassigned to an administrative advisory role pending completion of a remediation plan. Nora read that particular piece of carefully chosen language and understood what it meant and what it did not mean, and decided it was enough. Not everything was enough. Sometimes it was. Terry Alt, the day shift nurse who had told her Dr. Voss wanted the dog removed, approached her in the break room one afternoon about 2 weeks later. He stood at the coffee machine and looked at his cup and said, without looking at her, I should have pushed back. When she said the dog had to go, I knew something was off. Nora poured her own coffee. Yeah, I didn't know about the ADA thing. Now you do. He was quiet. How did you know to look it up? She thought about it. Habit. When something doesn't sit right, I look it up. Usually there's a reason it doesn't sit right. He nodded. He started to say something else and then didn't. She let him not say it. Hess was discharged on a Thursday 22 days after admission. His leg was healed enough for outpatient physical therapy. He had a follow-up plan with a VA mental health team, an actual one, with a name and a phone number and an appointment already scheduled, which Nora had confirmed twice because she had learned that scheduling without confirmation was not the same as scheduling. She was doing charting at the nurse's station when he came down the hallway with Ranger at his heel and a bag over one shoulder. He stopped at the desk. Daily, he said. Corporal Hess. He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was what she expected. Firm, brief, calibrated. Appointment set? She said. Set. Numbers in your phone? In my phone. Good. She let go of his hand. He stood there for a moment. Ranger sat beside him and looked up at her with the particular intelligence of a dog who has been trained to pay attention to humans and has done so his whole life. You were the only one, Hess said, in this whole building. Who actually read the file? She didn't know what to say to that, so she said what was true. More people should have. That's the part that needs to change. He nodded once. You think it will? She looked at him. I think it's harder to not change it now than to change it. That's usually how it works. He almost smiled. Optimist, pragmatist, she said. He turned and walked toward the exit. Ranger walked beside him. Head up, stride matched perfectly to his handler's. At the door, Hess paused, not looking back, and raised his right hand once, a gesture that was not quite a wave and not quite a salute, and was maybe something that didn't have a name yet, something between two people who had understood each other without having to explain much. Nora watched the door close behind them. She sat with it for a moment, the particular feeling of a thing that had been wrong and was now, if not fully right, at least pointed in the right direction. It wasn't triumph. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of having done exactly the thing she had been trained to do, and having done it when it was hard, and having not looked away. She picked up her pen. There were still 6 hours left in her shift, and there were other patients and other charts, and the light in the east corridor was flickering again, and the coffee was bad. She got back to work.